Good afternoon. I'm just lining up my YouTube so I can see the chat. I'm going to finish my reading. And so this will be a behind the scenes, rough and ready reading of Sacred. So this afternoon, I'm finishing my reading of Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Francoise O'Kane. Sacred Chaos. Sacred Chaos, Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self by Francoise O'Kane. This afternoon, I'm going to finish my reading. I have been reading from chapter 3, The Life Ritual, and right now I'm going to be reading from page 44, which has as a subtitle, Rites and Rituals. Rites and Rituals. The expression rite de passage has been very much popularized and sometimes applied in a loose manner. It may thus be useful to summarize briefly Van Gennep's original description in The Rites of Passage. At the core of such rites is a triphasic scheme: separation, liminal phase, and reintegration. This simple notion reveals essential aspects and remains applicable in the case of any ritual ceremony, since Van Gennep was explicitly more interested in describing forms rather than contents. Yet almost every theory of ritual has been influenced by his description. Psychologically speaking, the triphasic scheme corresponds in fact to an archetypal sequence that leading from death through transformation to new life. Thank you. I'm doing a live behind the scenes reading, and so I won't be stopping for comments except occasionally. Page 45. However, the process of transformation may evolve not so much because a death automatically brings about a transformation and a resurrection, but because passages generally can be affected only if a period of marginality takes place. During the liminal phase, a reality that is outside society and culture and outside ego life is experienced. Deep values and emotions are brought into the open, put on a ceremonial stage, and expressed in such a way that they may be accepted by the participants. Since this includes both mysterious and frightening elements, ritual work can be seen as allowing for a modification of negative polarities. During the ritual, the participants surrender their normal mode of perception and action. They scrutinize the values and axioms that have been chosen among vast possibilities to make up their culture, and thus come to a better acceptance of them. They also discover new dimensions: ritual as a means of giving shape to something arbitrary, culture, but also of reinforcing it and of providing it with a dynamic aspect by periodically forcing the group to return to its roots. In relation to the sacred, thus to a religious axis, Van Gennep defines rites of passage as magico-religious practices aimed at influencing natural events in such a manner that they cease to be dangerous. They are always carried out when a passage between the profane and the sacred worlds must take place. That is, when a transcendent element influences everyday life. According to him, in tribal societies, the sacred In tribal societies, the sacred characteristically threatens to invade almost every domain of personal and social life. This would explain why these societies carry out so many rituals. One may object to a perspective that implicitly sees tribal groups as less differentiated or less civilized than modern societies. I believe that even in modern societies, the sacred manifests in every domain of life, except, of course, when we repress it because of a belief in the absolute superiority of technology and science, or because of a unilateral adherence to rational progress. Our lives are made up of a series of passages, life stages, passage of the days and of the seasons, but especially personal crises and times of psychic anguish. And these passages always provoke an interaction between the sacred and the profane. Interesting synchronicity, pathos. Most of what happens in ceremonies carried out by groups can be transferred to the individual level, since the process in which a cosmos is being created out of chaos remains basically similar. However, one distinction may be useful. At the level of tribal groups, the term ritual is used to designate a clearly structured ceremony with a specific function. With regard to modern individuals, the movement, profane, sacred, profane, becomes part of a more personal quest and follows a rhythm that is not necessarily dictated by the group. And as far as analysis is concerned, it would be more correct to speak of a ritual-like behavior when referring to the regression to the self that helps the analysand come to terms with a dark pole. Yet both for the group and for the individual, the passage through marginality involves contact with a religious dimension. Myth and ritual are closely interrelated. That is, the myths that are particular to a certain tribe are enacted in the ritual. Thus, a given ritual is both a declaration about religion, this is what we believe, and a demonstration of its operation. This is how the gods work. In order to reach its aim, it proceeds in a very specific manner. During the ceremony itself, the threshold people, that is, those going through the liminal phase, are moved outside the social and cultural network, and therefore they escape classification. Their ambiguous and indeterminate position is expressed in a variety of symbols. A brief examination of some of these symbols, together with a description of actual contents found in the marginal phase, will provide a better understanding of the mechanisms involved at the group level. By analogy, it will also show what may happen during the phases of the analytic process in which the ego regresses toward the self. The novices are taken away from the village, speak in a secret language, and must respect specific taboos. They may be classified with the spirits of their ancestors and painted black. They return to a cosmic state, letting their hair and nails grow and covering their body in mud and dust. They lose their identity, are robbed of their clothes, and give up the name they had as children. Sometimes they are not allowed to speak, or only in a low voice. Other members of the tribe, quite often the women, are not allowed to see them. They are said to be embryos or babies and must learn to walk, talk, or eat again. The spirits must give birth to their new personality, so they are given a new name. There is a constant coexistence of life and death symbols. The novices may be perceived as androgynous or simultaneously human and animal. They are submitted to painful or frightening tests. This makes them malleable, ready for recreation. During the whole marginal period, they are taught practical skills and esoteric knowledge. The ambiguity of the liminal period is the ambiguity of the liminal period is underlined by the presentation of symbols that invert daily reality. The material world is turned upside down. This phase contains elements of playfulness and license. Everything becomes possible. The usual norms do not apply, and behaviors that potentially exist in everyday life may be experimented with. The novice must have confronted the chaos of the sacred to be able to accept the profane, and so the rituals are organized in such a way that instead of eliminating the dangers inherent to a period of transition, they let these be shown and experienced very concretely. For a brief period, the novice experiences the paradoxes of primeval being, like the Eskimo initiate, contemplating his skeleton, reduced to his own bones. The very foundations of life are systematically put in question. Stimuli and symbols are fired at the individual in such a manner that he cannot defend himself. The novice must live simultaneously in opposite dimensions, experiencing extreme poles of being. He is being shown what is possible while being taught what is approved. It is this sense that the marginal period has a transformative potential. It contains all possibilities, contrasts them, and opposes them to the negation of being that is potentially present in the sacred chaos. However, the sacred is not allowed to manifest in a totally arbitrary or uncontrolled manner. The ritual involves a conscious approach, having predefined its aims. The gods may be working through society as it performs its ritual duties, but the responsibility for the ceremonial acts rests in the hands of each group member. Because actions and consequences are made explicit, the message transmitted acquires validity. The ritual shows the invisible and interprets it through symbolization. It shows the unknown and refers to what the novice knows. The ceremony does not end in the border state. The participants look the sacred in the face, but they immediately move back to the profane and integrate to it the elements discovered. There is a dialectical relationship between the two dimensions. Ritual structures the cosmos and guides the individual from a state of passive submission to the group's tradition to a more cognitive acceptance of the sacred basis of culture. By analogy, the periods of psychic marginality, whether sought by the ego or imposed on it by the self, may be seen as providing the individual with a better perception of place within the cosmos and a new interpretation of personal myth. This aspect is especially important to persons with a negative constellation of the self archetype. This aspect is especially important to persons with a negative sorry. This aspect is especially important to persons with a negative constellation of the self archetype, for they may find meaning only if the dark elements are truly experienced and find a place within the ego's reality. On the other hand, rituals help air and resolve ambiguities and conflicts. At the level of the group, by stating a given perception of the world, they integrate conflicting elements into a coherent worldview. And by attributing a clearly defined position to each individual, they eliminate or channel the structure for power. At the personal level, by helping one move to a less ego-centered perception, at the personal level, by helping one move to a less ego-centered perception, a passage through a similar process can help the ego endure tension and conflict and allow the transcendent function to be constellated. Existential questions are then no longer formulated in terms of either or, and paradoxical solutions may be found by the psyche. According to Rudolf Otto's essay on the divine, man always has an ambivalent attitude toward transcendent aspects of life, since the powers involved are both benevolent and nefarious on the one hand, and not easily controlled on the other. The sacred is fundamentally given, both changing and immovable. It remains unquestionable and unfathomable. It precedes humanity and contains us. It is only when societies elaborate a religious system and confront the transcendence of the sacred that it starts losing some of its ambivalent nature. Religions, by postulating an order, provide us with a basis from which we attempt to cope with the unfathomable. They establish causes and relationships with respect to which prescribed gestures of practice. They establish causes and relationships with respect to which prescribed gestures or practices are believed to provoke certain consequences. The parallels with what happens at the psychic level in the relationship between the ego and the self are obvious. The self is unquestionable and unfathomable, and it manifests an ambiguous nature, both benevolent and nefarious. Further, far from being only an ordering principle, the self, like the sacred, is related to chaos. It pertains to nature and to the origins of humanity. It is a powerful entity which thinking and reason cannot simply structure and explain. The contrast between profane and sacred may also be seen as a contrast between order and chaos. But this does not necessarily imply a separation of order from chaos. Profane order remains part of a greater sacred whole. It is a modified form of chaos, and the uncontrollable, unstructured sacred may at any time invade daily life and upset the control exerted by individuals. In a similar way, the ego is contained and related to the self as a transcendent entity that may interfere with the control exerted by the ego. However, by discovering an adequate way of relating to the self, the ego may find a way of coping and remaining in touch with a dimension that gives the psyche a place within the chaos. The footnote here is I guess this is Rudolf Otto's book, The Idea of the Holy, an inquiry into the non-rational factor in the idea of the divine and its relation to the rational. Carrying on page 49. Van Gennep writes that the sacred periodically pivots on its own axis. That is, whenever everyday structures are being changed, whenever a passage to another life stage needs to take place, one comes face to face with chaos. The sacred may the sacred may invade the profane at any time. Any individual may be thrown back into a primeval, chaotic state, which both contrasts with everyday life and transcends it, thus also broadening it. Psychologically speaking, this phase must be seen as an opportunity for the ego to find a better grounding and to relate differently to the dark aspects in the unconscious. The ethnological This ethnological digression may already have taken us too far from our topic, but there are striking parallels between the manner in which a tribal group finds the means to survive in a threatening cosmos and the way in which Jung sees the individual attempting to confront fate and move along the path of individuation. And at this point, I have a side note in my book, which I'll read to you, or explain to you and then read to you. When I went to officer candidate school in the Marine Corps in 1967, much of the Marine Corps was deployed in Vietnam. And on the very first day of training, we were marched out into the training field, and there was a captain standing on a platform. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Vietnam, gentlemen, is an exceedingly hostile environment. In order to survive in this environment, you will have to be in the best condition of your life." And so that's how the Marine Corps tribe has us face chaos, because when you arrive in a deployed location, it is chaos. Now, reading on. So I'll reread the book again, page 49, what was said there. This ethnological digression may already have taken us too far from our topic, but there are striking parallels between the manner in which a tribal group finds the means to survive in a threatening cosmos and the way in which Jung sees the individual attempting to confront fate and move along the path of individuation. With regard to the confrontation with dark aspects in the self, the marginal period involves these aspects to a very great extent, and the novice must experience their power in an extreme form before being able to move on to the new stage. This dimension is particularly clear in shamanistic rituals. There, the novice must explicitly experience death, destruction, and chaos. It is probably no coincidence that over the past few years, so-called civilized people have rediscovered the form of initiation offered by such rituals. Indian medicine men are brought to Europe since Siberian shamans are not available. Why this fascination? One possible answer may be found in the way our societies repress darkness. Some individuals instinctively feel a need to compensate for this tendency and to experience the other pole in a dramatic manner. However questionable the organized mimicry of alien culture forms. The life ritual story recounted earlier in this chapter does not describe the manner in which the rite is carried out, except to say that the child has to narrate a new episode every day. On the other hand, his stories are not specifically connected to the dark, but to the self in all its aspects. Yet he does accomplish a ritual act dictated by a family tradition, repetitive. Dictated by a family tradition, repetitive, and endowed with a specific function. In order to continue to live, the grandfather must be fed by his grandson's stories. If I imagine the scene taking place every night, I see it as surrounded by a serious ceremonial atmosphere. It is not a sad event, but one in which both participants are aware of the importance of the moment. I would just add here that when I was in the 4th and 5th grade, and a couple of years before that, maybe the 2nd to 5th grade, my mother would tell a story to my brother and I, and sometimes my sister, every night. And she carried this on very much like Scheherazade for 3 or 4 years. And it was definitely a ritual of the kind that's being discussed here. Sacred time and psychic reality. Eugene Bleuler defined a form of thinking that he termed autistic undisciplined or non-objectivating, and of which he wrote that it tends not to adapt to reality and that it follows the logic of feelings. Later he added, quote, among other things, it also serves to fill those gaps in our knowledge that we perceive as frightening. It uses symbolism and drama in order to help us confront our inner conflicts, and thus helps us toward a greater inner maturity and harmony. Bleuler's original distinction was reformulated by Jung in his description of 2 kinds of thinking, directed and adapted, or subjective, actuated by inner motives. In Jung's view, the latter is neither infantile nor pathological. As Bleuler suggested, its archaic nature is directly related to the oldest layers of the human mind, long buried beneath the threshold of consciousness. By analogy, the differentiation may serve to define more precisely the characteristics of profane and sacred time. And I would just give an example. If you're directed thinking, you can expect everything, but if somebody throws a bat at you or throws something at your head, and you naturally reach up and either protect your face or catch it, that is adapted inner thinking that comes from the deepest part of the unconscious. In more than one way, sacred time is situated within the realm of autism. It follows its own illogical and subjective paths and is related to the transcendent and the beyond, whereas profane time is linear, containing its own beginning and end. The guide Chronos clearly symbolizes the duality of time, directed, autistic, linear, random, profane, sacred. When he is represented with 4 wings, 2 of which are outspread as if he were about to take flight, while 2 are lowered as if he were resting. The two pairs of wings symbolize the passage of time on the one hand, and the ecstasy of transport beyond time on the other. They symbolize the contrast between the continuity of past, present, and future, and the simultaneity of the eternal. The second phase of Chronos is sometimes depicted with four eyes, two in front and two behind, thus personifies an autistic time that is infinite with no beginning, end, or direction. It symbolizes a dimension of sacred time that can be grasped only in an approximate manner. The kinship between the self and sacred time is fairly obvious. Both have a subjective, unfathomable dimension, and both are subjectively motivated. That is, they follow their own internal logic. Both just are, without any reference to norms or value systems. Without any reference to norms or value systems situated outside their field. In the self, as we have seen, each component has a value only as it is assigned by the ego and not intrinsically. As for sacred time, it precedes and stands beyond any linearity, and thus any kind of hierarchy. Mircea Eliade, in Myth of the Eternal Return, writes of the Illud Tempus, that time at the beginning of the cosmos, when everything was being created and through which everything will be recreated. He adds that as societies move toward more consciousness, they tend to attribute a more historical, more linear dimension to time, and to move away from the initial time, from the mythical beginnings of the creation. Profane time would thus be historical, while sacred time is ahistorical. For Eliade, rituals help the group reconnect with the totality, with the wholeness of the Illud Tempus. They could thus be seen as an attempt at participating, be it only for a limited time, in the original unconscious within they could thus be seen as an attempt at participating, be it only for a limited time, in the original unconscious within which thinking and experience surrender directedness in order to be nourished by images and autistic motifs. I'll read that sentence again. I have in my notes on the side of this page the Last Supper, or the Eucharist. They could thus be seen as an attempt at participating, be it only for a limited time, in the original unconscious within which thinking and experience surrender directedness in order to be nourished by images and autistic motifs. But otherwise, rituals are a means of contacting the divine child, Jung's initial and terminal creature. And I'll just give you the footnote here. The divine child is discussed in Psychology of the Child Archetype, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, volume 9I, paragraphs 259 and following. And if you're a regular member of this reading group, you can certainly find that reference. I'll reread this sentence. Put otherwise, rituals are a means of contacting the divine child, Jung's initial and terminal creature. The contact with sacred time and its images are also provides the individual with the means to participate in a superpersonal, eternal psyche. This participation, this eternal return through ritual to mythical origins, provides us with the knowledge that we are not alone. I always get caught on page turns. Provides us with the knowledge that we are not alone. It thus allows us to face the dark aspects of the sacred and of the self without suffering more than necessary and without the pain provoked by isolation. We are supported by the awareness that many others have had this experience. Let us go back to our fantastic story as an image of the way in which a return to the Iliad Tempest may be affected and may bring about a renewal of life. Because the child imagines, in the strongest sense of the word, the grandfather is able to reach past linear biological time and to connect with the whole man, feeding on a transcendent dimension. Intrapsychologically, since the two figures must be seen as two aspects of the same psyche, a vital element, the child, and an active commitment in which the daily episode as an imaginary representation allows for a connection with the sacred, make it possible for the whole psyche to live along a religious axis that transcends the individual level of the linearity of time. Kronos simultaneously shows his two faces. The child and the grandfather spend most days in a linear reality, but each also works at maintaining a contact with the sacred dimension of time. They are thus both able to feed from the original wholeness and to find a place in the cosmos. Of course, the contrast between profane and sacred times may also be seen as a contrast between the conscious and the unconscious. We would then have three not equivalent pairs: directed autistic thinking, conscious, unconscious. Sometimes I have to figure out how these are to be read. We would then have three not equivalent pairs: directed autistic thinking, conscious, unconscious, and profane, sacred. My basic hypothesis is as follows. By resting at the junction of each of these pairs, ritual work, this term being applied here both to traditional ceremonies and to a regression along the ego-self axis, makes it possible to overcome their qualities, or rather to situate them within an equilibrium that is otherwise threatened by the tendency to dichotomize and to attribute primacy to logical thinking, to technology, and to situate them within an equilibrium that is otherwise threatened by the tendency to dichotomize and to attribute primacy to logical thinking, to technology, and to the logos version of progress. I have used the expression imaginary representations to designate those aspects of the ritual work that may support a healing. In terms of Jungian psychology, they include the contents of the personal and collective unconscious, dreams and their symbols, folktales and myths, etc. Technically speaking, they may be accessed by a form of active imagination, representation. At a more basic level, they can be understood as a function of feeling and of affective needs, as in Bleuler's autistic thinking. It may be that we are no longer fluent enough in speaking and corresponding language. We have lost contact with the form of thinking and with the symbolic aspect of daily events. Instead, we tend to use clear formulations to describe and rationalize our cosmos. Yet in order to remain connected with the religious aspect Yet, in order to remain connected with the religious axis discussed above, we must be able to relate to the half-light of images that express more than they say. I sometimes feel that too much value is being attributed to the light of consciousness, at least as far as the analytic process and its existential dimension goes. Theorizing is one thing, relating to the unconscious and understanding the language of the psyche is quite another. Jung was searching for an equilibrium between conscious and unconscious. Three more pages. Jung was searching for an equilibrium between conscious and unconscious, or even Jung was searching for an equilibrium between conscious and unconscious, or even was pleading for a reevaluation of the unconscious. It seems to me that it is dangerous to put too much stress on aims such as broadening consciousness. For this risks telling dreams what they mean rather than listening to their message and watching the ego's emotional reaction. What is more, we analysts sometimes create an artificial border between conscious and unconscious by isolating the symbolic material that crosses our path, by treating it within a closed system of interpretation. In other words, we may, paradoxically, dichotomize too much the pair conscious-unconscious. Further, I believe that we tend to concentrate too much on explaining and interpreting as if this were the ultimate aim of analysis, while the need of an analysand may be just as much to reconnect with the marginal characteristics of the sacred and the unconscious. We need models for thinking about the analytic process and structuring it. However, what happens within the process must be of an emotional, existential nature. And at this level, explanations and models are useless. What is more likely to bring healing is a countertransference relationship, allowing the analysand's ego to connect with psychic reality, and in particular with the original chaos in which one's individual cosmos may be re-anchored. This vital process cannot be contained within a rational vocabulary. Its verbalization may even inhibit the emotional reaction that are essential both to the transference countertransference and to the passage through a marginal phase outside the ego world. Michael Fordham writes that archetypal reactions form the basis of analytical. Michael Fordham writes that archetypal reactions form the basis of an analytic technique. Archetypes in Archetypes, in a Jungian sense, are obviously an integral component of the sacred time that renews the profane. And of Hillman's Mundus Imaginalis, Fordham's archetypal reactions are thus a means of contacting and relating to this time in both its friendly and nefarious dimensions. The sharing of the transference countertransference relationship provides the analytic process with a liminal dimension, and this is particularly important with regard to the confrontation with the dark self. Under the analyst's guidance, under the analyst's guidance, the analysand can pass from a personal to a transpersonal level, away from a feeling of being isolated and into a more generally human experience. Instead of being a prisoner to the contrast between his or her own suffering and the norms of happiness defined by society, the analysand is able to return safely to the very source of his human sorrow, to the dark and threatening dimensions of being. If we accept that marginality allows the rites of passage to achieve their aim, then we should be prepared to accept that healing. Then we should be prepared to accept that healing will, of necessity, involve marginality. Healing thus also involves the reversal of profane and reality. Healing thus involves the reversal of profane reality and the return to another time characteristic of that phase. Moving away from the profane implies moving away from its norms and from a collective ego perception of reality. It is so wrong then to postulate that it is by deliberately swimming against the current, by refusing to be influenced by collective norms of progress and transformation, that the individual may be healed. It is by accepting the dark, the ugly, the sick, that we may succeed in being fearful to the true. It is by accepting the dark, the ugly, the sick, that we may succeed in being faithful to the true nature of the soul. And we need to accept chaos so as to maintain a contact with the sacred, and thus with the religious access indispensable to a healthy psychic validity. And thus with the religious access indispensable to a healthy psychic vitality. More generally speaking, a passage through the liminal aspects of the unconscious provides an experience that is essential to individuation. According to Jung, the individual stands between the conscious and the unconscious part of the collective psyche. Individuation should not be taken to mean only becoming more oneself and going, so to speak, against the collective. It also involves fulfilling a function within that collective, finding a place there. Quote, every mental or moral individuality differs from all the others, and yet is so constituted as to render every man equal to other men. Every living being that is able to develop itself individually without constraint will best realize by the very perfection of its individuality the ideal type of its species, and by the same token will achieve a collective value, unquote. As we have seen, the function of rites is not only to make the sacred chaos less dangerous or less painful. Ritual action is also a search for the nourishment and renewal provided by the superpersonal wisdom of the sacred world. This element is clearly shown, for instance, in the biblical story of Jonah's journey in the whale. He cuts the whale's heart and eats it. At this level, marginality may be closely related to the manifestation of the transcendent function. A contact with collective experience and with the objective psyche offers elements to be discovered that the profane ego is unable to see. During the marginal phases, by moving away from the tensions resulting from the various norms and alternatives faced by the ego, and by surrendering ego control, the individual allows the psyche to take the lead. In so doing, one may discover ways of best realizing the ideal type of its species, that is, of becoming more human. It is always very difficult to escape the value judgments dictated by cultural norms, since culture is mainly unconscious. By referring to ethnological theories, I have tried to escape some of the determinism of my own Western thinking and to situate the problem outside of the dichotomies enforced by Christianity. The elements that have been discussed here as characteristic of the confrontation with sacred time through rituals can be seen as components of a specific attitude, can be seen as components to a specific attitude toward that dimension of being. In a later chapter, they will be expressed in terms of components in the propitious attitude toward the self and its darkest energies. This attitude, by bridging the gap between sacred chaos and profane order, may serve to give...
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat it?
I do not know why my Siri just speaks out, but let me go back here. Good Lord. I'm going to start that chapter, that paragraph again. We're almost done. It is always very difficult to escape the value judgments dictated by cultural norms, since culture is mainly unconscious. By referring to ethnological theories, I have tried to escape some of the determinism of my own Western thinking and to situate the problem outside the dichotomies enforced by Christianity. The elements that have been discussed here as characteristic of the confrontation with sacred time through rituals can be seen as components of a specific attitude toward that dimension of being. In a later chapter, they will be expressed in terms of components in the propitious attitude toward the self and its darkest energies. This attitude, by bridging the gap between sacred chaos and profane order, may serve to give each individual a place within a cosmos that includes them both, rather than providing one with a certainty about the meaning of life, a certainty that would, after all, be rather fortuitous. Before closing this first theoretical part and moving to a discussion of more pragmatic and symbolic aspects, I cannot resist quoting a beautiful passage from a text by Sheila Moon. Its images very adequately show what is involved in individuating. Quote, the Ashanti of Africa believed that the Creator gave a bit of his spirit to everyone whom he sent to earth, and that with the gift of that bit of spirit, the man's soul was bound up that man's destiny. So let me read that again. And that with the gift of that bit of spirit, the man's soul was bound up in that man's destiny. what he was to become and to do in the world. What we need to do to fulfill our own destiny as creatures is to be as rich, as total in our unique humanness as a tree in its treeness. Yet one further step is needed from us, which the tree does not have to take. For the tree has not lost itself, since from the beginning it has been humbly obedient to its particularity. Not so with us. We have become confused by we have become confused in the cerebral labyrinth of whence and whither. We have sought to be more than human. That is our greatness, but have insisted on our own definitions of how, and this is our littleness. Let me reread that because that's important. We have sought to be more human. I'm sorry. We have sought to be more than human. That is our greatness, but have insisted on our own definitions of how. That is our littleness. If we can but learn, as this myth shows, the simple and hard lesson of emergence, of going into the darker places to follow the restless longing upward, of letting no small thing stay forgotten and unhonored, then we shall be whole. Then we shall be related to the unconscious powers within us to live and God. Then we shall be related to the unconscious powers within us of life and God. This is our redemption, unquote. Okay, I'll be right there. Okay, and part 2 of this book begins with a short quote, which I'm going to read. A person with the beginning gift of the mind must always try to include his heart in his decisions. A man can live out his entire life without ever finding more than what was already within him as his beginning gift. But if he wishes to grow, he must become a seeker and seek for himself the other ways. This is from, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this very well, but it's from Himyosh Storm, Song of Himyoka. I don't know what the origin of that is. But anyway, that is my reading. And I would just observe that what I've been reading really, in my view, sums up our duality in the United States right now. And it applies to both sides of the duality equally. And so we all need to, we're all stuck in this marginal place right now, which is expressed every night by the 3 main cable networks. And so I think it's important for all of us to consider that point and try to find out where the balance is appropriately, because in the end, we're all Americans, and we have to find the balance between our brethren and sisters. And so I'm not going to go into it beyond that, but anyway, that is the reading, and I am going to leave this one cooking, although it's still a mess because of all my poor reading, but I'm going to edit both parts of today's reading in one reading and then put it back out as a different essay. So thank you for joining me today, and I'll see you another time. Bye-bye.